Okay, so the recording will miss the little introduction that I did, but we can start right off with the first source, which is the first Mishnah in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, which talks about Rosh Hashanah, and 99% of it is talking about the Rosh Hashanah that we celebrate with the shofar and all of the apples and honey. But there is 1% of it is another type of Rosh Hashanah, and that's going to be addressed in this very first Mishnah. So can I ask someone to read the first source in Hebrew or English?
I can read. ארבעה ראשי שנים הם, באחד בניסן ראש השנה למלכים ולרגלים, באחד באלול ראש השנה למעשר בהמה, רבי אלעזר ורבי שמעון אומרים באחד בתשרי. באחד בתשרי ראש השנה לשנים ולשמיטין וליובלות, לנטייה ולירקות. באחד בשבט ראש השנה לאילן, כדברי בית שמאי, והתחילה לדברים ב-15 בו.
Thanks. Can you translate or sum up?
There are 4 New Years. The first of Nisan is the New Year for kings and for holidays. The first of Elul is Rosh Hashanah for Maser Behema. Rabbi Elazar.
So it's a tithe on animals. If you would 1/10 of your flock you would give. So that's this Maaser Behema. Yeah, keep going. We're not going to focus on that type of Maaser, but keep going.
Thanks. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon say, in the first of the first of Tishrei that you have Maaser Behema, the 10th type on animals. The Chad B'Tishrei Rosh Hashanah L'Shanim, and the first of Tishrei is the new year for the years. Shimtin, and for Shemitah, the Yovelot, and for the Yovel counting, the Jubilee year, the 50th year, the Lenitiyah for planting, the Yarakot, and for vegetables. I guess different tithes on these things. The Echad B'Shvat, and the first of Shvat is Rosh Hashanah L'Ilan, is the new year for the trees. Beit Shammai, like according to Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel says the 15 on the 15th of Shvat is the new year for the trees.
Right. So we're going to get into this a little bit more, but any thoughts on what it means to be a new year? What does that mean, a new year for the trees? Any thoughts on what that might mean? Before we get into the Gemara is gonna really unpack all of this, but just some cursory first immediate thoughts as to what it might be, the new year for the tree, what that would mean.
It's because you can't use the fruit of the tree for 3 years.
Interesting. Okay, so you're thinking. So what does that mean? So you're suggesting that if a plant,
if the tree exists on Tu B'Shvat, then you count a year, I guess.
Yeah. So you're simultaneously correct and incorrect. The correct part is that's absolutely right, but that's what the Gemara says. That's what it's referring to when it says that Tishrei is the new year for trees, for planting. That's what it says. That's what it means for planting. Is it? You can see you planted on in the month of Av, 2 months before Rosh Hashanah, the first day of Tishrei. Then you have 2 months. That counts as year 1, and now it's year number 2 once Rosh Hashanah. So you're right, but the Gemara is going to say that idea is not about the new year for the trees here. That's about the planting, and everyone agrees that's on Rosh Hashanah as we know it. So, but that's a very, very good thought that I would not have thought of had I not already read the Gemara. So we'll get into this more specifically in the Gemara itself, but the idea, the way the Gemara understands it, is that there's this idea of tithing, and we're going to look at all the different tithes that exist in source number 2. But this idea of tithing is that you have produce of a certain year, and you have to take 10% of that produce. So when do we say it's and you can't mix year 1 and year 2, right? You can't, you can't pay your taxes. I can't pay, combine fiscal year of 2019 and 2020 and then sort of like pay it together. I have to pay fiscal year of 2019, pay the fiscal year of 2020, pay the fiscal year of 2021. The taxes have to be each in their own separate fiscal year. So the fiscal year, so to speak, the plant year starts on Tu B'Shvat. So plants harvested maybe or budding before Tu B'Shvat, that's last year. Plants that bud or are harvested this year are part of this year's tithe. And so that's the demarcation. The Gemara is going to go into that more and address that more, but that's this idea. So that's why Tu B'Shvat is important, is because it's sort of like it marks the end of the previous year and starts the new year for trees as far as when we tithe. So what is this tithing thing? So source number 2, there are multiple types of tithes and multiple types of it's called truma, pulling out of the grain. So can I ask someone to read? These can just be in English. There are several. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm scrolling around. I forgot that I'm sharing my screen so you can see all this movement. Source number 2, we have Truma Gedola, Ma'aser Rishon, Trumat Ma'aser, Ma'aser Sheni. Can I have someone just quickly read in English each one of these little portions?
I'll volunteer if no one else is. Okay.
By all means.
The Lord spoke to Aaron, I hereby give you charge of my gifts, all the sacred donations of the Israelites. I grant them to you and to your sons as a prerequisite, a due for all time. All the best of the new oil, wine, and grain, the choice parts that they present to the Lord, I give to you.
Right. So here, this idea of Truma Gedola, that every gift, the best of the new oil, new wine, new grain, the choicest parts, which is understood to be like the first, right? The first is the best. That is given, Hashem says, God says, that goes to Aaron, that goes to the Kohen. So that's Truma Gedola. It's called Truma Gedola, the great, I don't know what the right translation of Truma is, the right removing, lifting up from your produce, that goes to the Kohen. So that's Truma Gedola. So that's one type of gift that is relevant, that's given, that you can't mix year 1 and year 2. That's one of the taxes, so to speak. Maaser Rishon, Marlene, you want to keep going?
Okay. And to the Levites, I hereby give all the tithes in Israel as their share in return for the services that they perform, the services of the tent of meeting.
Okay, and so Maaser Rishon, so you just gave a portion to the priest. Now you give a portion, a tenth. It's Maaser. It's like the I don't know what the English word tithe. I'm guessing it comes from the same root as Maaser, but Maaser, if you know Hebrew roots, the root ayin sin resh, like eser, 10, Maaser, a tenth. So a tenth of the produce. Also, now this produce goes to the Levite for the service, in return for the services that they perform. Okay, keep going, Marlene.
The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the Levites and say to them, when you receive from the Israelites their tithes, which I have assigned to you as your share, you shall set aside from them 1/10 of the tithe as a gift to the Lord. This shall be counted to you as your gift, as with the new grain from the threshing floor or the flow from the vat. So shall you on your part set aside a gift for the Lord from all the tithes that you receive from the Israelites. And from them you shall bring the gift for the Lord to Aaron the priest. You shall set aside all gifts due to the Lord from everything that is donated to you, from each thing its best portion, the part thereof that is to be consecrated.
Okay, so you non-Kohen give truma and to the Kohen, and then you give maaser to the Levi. And now God's telling the Levi, by the way, you can't just pocket everything that you received. 1/10 of what you received also goes to the Kohen. So the Kohen is getting 2. The Kohen's getting the truma, and it's also getting what's called trumat maaser, a gift from the maaser. So that's going to the Kohen. So you've now done 2 things. The average person, they've given truma from their produce. They've given ma'as to the Kohen. They've given maaser rishon, which means the first tithe. They've given that to the Levi. And then the Levi goes and takes from what they've received and gives 1/10 of that also to the Kohen. Okay, then there's maaser sheni. Keep going, Marlene. I'll scroll down.
Yeah, if you can scroll.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You shall set aside every year 1/10 part of all the yield of your sowing that is brought from the field. You shall consume the tithes of your new grain and wine and oil, and the firstlings of your herds and flocks, in the presence of the Lord your God, in the place where he will choose to establish his name, so that you may learn to revere the Lord your God forever. Should the distance be too great for you, should you be unable to transport them because the place where the Lord your God has chosen to establish his name is far from you, and because the Lord your God blessed you, you may convert them into money. Wrap up the money and take it with you to the place that the Lord your God has chosen. and spend the money on anything you want, cattle, sheep, wine, or other intoxicant, or anything you may desire. And you shall feast there in the presence of the Lord your God and rejoice with your household.
Right. So this Maaser Sheni, this second tithe, doesn't go to anyone. You just bring it up and eat it in Jerusalem. And if you live far away and you have, I don't know, you have grapes, and the grapes, it's a several day journey, and the grapes are just not going to last that long. You get to Jerusalem and they're going to be rotted and moldy, and you're not going to want to eat them. So it's fine. So you convert the grapes onto money. You sell the grapes. You take money with the grapes, and then you bring that money up to Jerusalem, and then you spend that money in Jerusalem, and then you buy grapes and eat it there. And that's Maaser Sheni. So you have Truma Gedola, which goes to the Kohen. Then there's Maaser Rishon, which goes to the Levi. And then there's Maaser Sheni, the second tithe, that goes to you, and you bring that up to Jerusalem. Now there is, and we're going to see in the Talmud, there is an additional type of Maaser, additional type of tithe that's not explicit anywhere in the Torah, but the rabbis learn it out. And we'll get there in source number 3, but that's a tithe to the poor person. That there are certain years, the years 3 and year 6 in a 7-year cycle, year 3 and year 6, instead of doing this second tithe that goes to you and you bring it to Jerusalem, year 3 and year 6, that produce goes to someone who's poor. And that's nowhere explicit in the Torah, but the rabbis learn out years 3 and 6, that money, it's like mandatory tzedakah that you have to give. Instead of eating your own wine or fruit, you give that to someone who doesn't have anything. And that's called Maaser Ani, that's called the poor tithe, because it goes to the poor people. And year 7, by the way, in that 7-year cycle is the year of Shemitah. And in the year of Shemitah, no one owns any produce. And so you don't do any of this because your field is not really your field. The produce is not technically your produce. I could walk into your field and take it. The Kohen could walk into your field and take it. So it's not technically owned by anyone. We'll see, we might come back to this topic of Shemitah later on, but that's year 1. You have all those tithes, Truma, Maaser Rishon, Maaser Sheni. Year 2, same thing. Year 3, it's the same thing, except instead of Maaser Sheni, it's Maaser Ani, goes to the poor person. Year 4, 5, like year 1 and 2. Year 6, like year 3. And then year 7, nothing.
Does that add up to more than 1/10 for each person? I mean, because a Maaser is the 10th part of what you have. But I guess I'm not quite putting the math together as to how much you're giving.
You're giving 1/10 of what you have. So truma is a truma. So actually, we're not going to go into it. But for truma, there's no specific quantity. So the rabbis come up with like an idea of what the best thing for you to do is. 1/30th or 1/40th. I think 1/40th, 1/50th, 1/60th. I think they say like the average is 1/50th. I think 1/40th is the nice thing to do. 1/60th is like a worse thing to do. The average is, I think these are explicit Mishnayot that I just haven't studied in a long enough, too recently. Thank you, Noam. Laila Tov. So there's no real quantity that's given for the truma, and then what is left, you give 1/10, and then another 1/10, and that's that. Does that help or not?
Yeah, so, okay. But the final 10th though is what you're bringing so that you can feast.
Correct. Yeah. Right. Okay. Any other questions before jumping into source number 3?
Is probably a silly question, but is this still being done today, Rabbi?
Excellent question. We're going to get to that. We'll get to that. Don't worry. Now I know that I can call on you for that source. So thank you.
Oh, no.
You can read it in English. Don't worry.
Okay.
I'm not going to quiz your Hebrew reading abilities yet. Okay, source number 3. Any other questions before moving on to source number 3? Okay, so source number 3. This is where the Talmud is going to really unpack what these different New Years are. Because if you remember, in source number 1, we said that Tu B'Shvat was the new year, according to Beit Hillel, which is how we follow. We said that was for trees, the new year for trees. But if you remember, the first of Tishrei is for vegetables. So it seems like vegetables and trees have different cutoff dates. When you consider season 1 and season 2, for the tree is in the month of Shvat that we're in right now, but for the vegetable, it seems that year 1 and year 2 is pointed at a different time, and that's in the beginning of the month of Tishrei. So, well, the Talmud's going to unpack this in source number 3. So I want to read for us source number 3. I can do it.
Okay, so
Margot, please.
is that right?
Yeah, please.
The Mishnah taught, and the first of Tishrei is the new year for vegetables. It is taught in a Braita, the first of Tishrei is the new year for vegetables and for tithes and for vows. The Gemara asks, what is meant by the term for vegetables? It means for the vegetable tithe, that one may not take truma or tithes from vegetables picked before Rosh Hashanah in order to fulfill the obligations for vegetables picked after Rosh Hashanah.
Right. You can skip the next paragraph. It's not necessary right now. We can actually skip the next 2 paragraphs and then skip to the sages taught at the bottom of the page.
The sages taught in a Braita, if one picked vegetables on the eve of Rosh Hashanah before the sun had set, so that they belonged to the previous year, and then he returned and picked more vegetables after sunset, so that they belonged to the new year, one may not set aside teruma and tithe from the one to the other, as one may not set aside teruma and tithe from the new crop for the old, nor from the old crop for the new.
Right. So when it comes to vegetables, we're saying that the year is going to be, when you gathered it. So when you picked those vegetables right before Rosh Hashanah and right after Rosh Hashanah, those belong to 2 different years, and you can't then combine them together and take 1/10 of. No, you gotta take a 10th of this and a 10th of that. You can't. So it might, in practice, it might not necessarily be that different. But if you had a significant yield in one year and not in another year, that could 10% of what you have from that year could be really different. Okay, keep going.
If it was the second year of the sabbatical cycle going into the 3rd year, the halacha is from what he picked in the 2nd year, he must set aside first tithe, which he gives to a Levite, and second tithe, which he eats in Jerusalem. From what he picked in the 3rd year, he must set aside first tithe and poor man's tithe, which he gives to one who is needy.
Right, and that's what we said before. So there's truma is going to be given every year. So there's no question about that. But when it comes to the maaser sheni, the second tithe, so that's different. If it's year 1 or year 2, so your second tithe goes to you. You bring it up to Jerusalem. If it's year 3, it's not called the second tithe. That would go to you and you'd eat in Jerusalem. In fact, is called the poor man's tithe, maaser ani, and that's given to someone who's needy, and that's the tzedakah. That's year 3. Okay, keep going, Margot.
From where are these matters derived that during the 3rd year one must set aside poor man's tithe and not second tithe? Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said, the verse states, when you have made an end of tithing all the tithes of your produce in the 3rd year, which is the year of the tithe, this is referring to a year when there is only one of the 2 tithes that had been given in the previous year. How so? One sets aside first tithe and poor man's tithe, which is explicitly mentioned in that section, and second tithe is nullified that year.
In other words, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is saying, you don't necessarily know this, but I'm telling you that in year 3, and it's also in year 6, but it's not here, in year 3 and year 6, that second tithe doesn't exist. That second tithe goes to the poor. That's called the poor man's tithe. And so here, so he's now introduced an additional tithe that is not really anywhere stated completely explicitly, but only sort of referred to, that the rabbis then learn out and derive and say, oh, there is this poor man's tithe, and that's what Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi sort of explains. We didn't read that verse inside, I don't think, verse 26:12, but I guess we can take Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi's word for it right now that he believes that verse is proof that there's such a thing as a poor man's tithe that's given in a year when there's no second tithe. So again, because it sometimes gets really confusing. Truma Gedola, Truma goes to the Kohen every year. Maaser Sheni goes to the Levi every year. I'm sorry, Maaser Rishon goes to the Levi every year. Maaser Sheni goes to you in Jerusalem in years 1, 2, 4, 5. In years 3 and 6, instead of going to you in Jerusalem, it goes to the poor person. If you're looking for a fun mnemonic, if this helps, there's a fun mnemonic, I guess, in the Shir Shel Yom, right? The Psalm of the Day that's recited at the end of Shacharit services every day. The two shortest psalms are 3 for the one for Tuesday, which is the 3rd day of the week, and Friday, which is the 6th day of the week. So it's very easy to remember the day that has the shortest psalm of the day, because it's a poor day. It says a short psalm, so it's easy to remember. 3 and 6 shortest psalms. Year 3 and year 6 goes to the poor, the poorest person. So anyway, I learned that when I was in yeshiva, and it's stuck with me for 12 years. So I'm sharing it with you now. If you ever are on Jeopardy and need to, what year is the poor tithe? You can remember. Oh, it's the year that corresponds to the day that has a short psalm of the day. Anyway, okay. So that's all with vegetables, right? We said already, the Mishnah had said vegetables, the time that it turns over is Rosh Hashanah. Trees, we said, according to Beit Hillel, which is how we practice, Beit Hillel says Shvat, the middle of the month of Shvat. So that's going to be in source number 4 is going to say what that means exactly. Someone want to read for us source number 4?
Okay, I'll take over.
Thanks.
The sages taught in a Barita, a tree whose fruits were formed before the 15th of Shvat is tithed in accordance with the previous year. And if the fruits were formed after the 15th of Shvat, it is tithed in accordance with the coming year.
Right. So according to this opinion right now, you want to know when you say, oh, it's today, Tu B'Shvat is coming up. Which fruits have blossomed, have formed? They formed before Tu B'Shvat. Okay, that's the previous year. They formed after Tu B'Shvat. You go like that. So according to this opinion, you just look at the tree and see, do we have fruit here? And fruit, ripening, forming fruit. Okay, keep going.
Rabbi Nechemiah said, in what case is this statement said? It is said with regard to a tree that produces 2 broods, 2 crops in a single year. The Gemara interrupts with a question about the wording of this Baraita. Does it enter your mind to say 2 broods? Animals produce broods, but trees do not. Rather say like 2 broods. That is 2 seasons worth of crops.
All right, so there's just a parenthetical comment about the language used in the Mishnah. But okay, 2 crops. Rabbi Nechemiah says if it has 2 crops, okay, so then the crop number 1, aka the fruit that produced, the first half and the second half. You go if there are 2 crops, okay. But you can continue.
The Baraita continues. But in the case of trees that produce only 1 brood of fruit, for example, palm trees and olive trees and carob trees, which yield fruit only once a year, although their fruit took form before the 15th of Shvat, they are tithed in accordance with the coming year, since they follow the time of the fruit's picking. According to Rabbi Nechemiah, most fruit will be tithed according to the time that the fruit is picked, since only a minority of fruit trees produce 2 crops a year.
Okay, so we have this machloket. There's this debate in the Mishnah about what does it mean? What needs to happen before Tu B'Shvat versus after Tu B'Shvat, or when it comes to vegetables before Rosh Hashanah or after Rosh Hashanah, in order to determine when the year, whether it's part of year A or year B, does it have to do with fruit forming or actually fruit picking? But okay, so that's why Tu B'Shvat or Rosh Hashanah is really relevant, because it'll help us know, what year is this going to be tithed and truma, what is it going to be part of? And now we're going to get to Matthew's question, which is, this is all nice and interesting. What does it mean today? So Matthew, I'm going to ask you to read for us source number 5, if you're still there.
Yeah, I'm still here. Yeah.
It's a short one, so I'll have you read 5, 6, and 7 just for fun.
Okay. Produce grown outside the land of Israel that came into the land is subject to halal. If it went out from here to there, Rabbi Elazar makes it liable, but Rabbi Akiva makes it exempt.
Okay, so this Mishnah tells us that challah, which is food taken from it's a portion taken from dough when you're making bread. So there, let's say you have, wheat that was grown outside of the land of Israel, and then you brought it into the land of Israel. So that is subject to challah. You'd have to take out challah from it. But if it was started in Israel, you have grains, flour from Israel, took them out of Israel, Rabbi Eliezer says you still have to take challah out of it. Rabbi Kiva says one is exempt. You don't have to take challah from it. On the basis of this, Maimonides in source number 6 is going to say the following. Matthew, keep going with source number 6.
Those produce from Israel that left to outside Israel is exempt from challah and truma and maser, as it says that I bring you there. There you are obligated outside of Israel. You are exempt.
Right. So Rambam, Maimonides says, look, there is the challah. He groups challah and he groups truma and he groups maser all together, and he says, look, the Mishnah is he goes on the basis of Rabbi Akiva and says, look, the Torah says you have to take out truma, you have to take out maser, you have to take out challah there when you get there to the land asher ani mevi etchem shama, to the land that I bring you there. That land, Israel, that's where you have to do it. Everywhere else, you're exempt, Rambam says. So Rambam, Maimonides, goes according to Rabbi Akiva and says, look, the Torah says all these agricultural laws are in force in Israel, referring to produce in Israel. So if you're not in Israel, even if the produce is from Israel, if you're not in Israel, it's exempt, because the Torah's intention was that only the produce of Israel in Israel would be obligated. That's how Maimonides understands it. And he would say that there's absolutely no requirement whatsoever to take truma or maaser outside of Israel. And maybe even when it comes to challah, we're not going to talk about challah right now. If you bake your own challah and you normally take out a chunk of challah, you should still do that. And we can have a further conversation another point in time about exactly how and why you do that. But we're not going to talk about challah right now. But truma and maaser, according to Maimonides, outside of Israel, nothing doing. You don't have to worry about it. That's what he says over here. Any questions so far?
What does it mean to take challah from perot?
It's a good question. Payroad is just sort of like the general term for, I think, for produce. I think he means challah would still be from wheat, barley, oat, rye, spelt, like some of these bready foods. But you're right. The term payroad seems to be implying like fruits and apples and oranges and figs and dates and olives, which you wouldn't take challah from. But I think he means payroad there in a more produce sense. But good point. Okay, so that Rambam, you would say, according to Rambam, there is no obligation whatsoever to take truma or maser. The problem is, well, actually, we're not going to get to the problem yet. Ra'avad, commentary, Rabbi Avraham, source number 7, the Ra'avad, who always comments on Rambam and sort of tears him apart. So he tears the Rambam apart over here, and he says, source number 7. I already see there a couple typos that crept their way in here. But if someone wants to read for us source number 7 in Hebrew or in English, but what the Ra'avad's comment, what he doesn't like about what Maimonides says, or maybe not doesn't like, but he tweaks it slightly. So the Ravid says that, yeah, Matthew, you want to take it?
Oh, yeah, I was going to just step up just for the silence. Israeli produce that leaves, I say that it seems...
Okay, keep going. Yeah, sorry.
I say that it seems to me that Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva only argue about a biblical obligation, that Rabbi Eliezer argues that the requirement follows where the fruit is completed, and Rabbi Akiva says that it follows where the obligation to make maser occurs, which is when it was laid out, which it was laid out. But rabbinically, even though it left to outside Israel and was spread out there, rabbinically, it is no different than the land which border Israel, where there is a rabbinic obligation to separate. And so that people won't end up eating untied Israeli produce. Anyone who disagrees is mistaken.
What he's saying here is he's saying essentially, he says, okay, when Rambam says that there's no obligation, that must only be biblical. There's no biblical obligation. And I think the key part that what he's getting to, that I will focus on, is this statement that he makes, that there's the Talmud learns out that areas that border the land of Israel, they don't produce that grows in, let's say, Syria or Jordan or in Egypt. Produce that grows in these lands that border the land of Israel, one has a rabbinic obligation to tithe from there in the lands that border Israel. Why? The rabbi said, because look, if you have someone living in Egypt, okay, where is the border marker exactly? Are you in Egypt? Is he in Israel? Are they in Syria? Are they in Lebanon? Are they in Israel? Like, it's confusing where they are. So the rabbi said, if you're in a border land, if you're close to the land of Israel, you have a rabbinic obligation to take to do maaser and truma, because otherwise people are going to get confused and people are going to think maybe you got produce from Israel, or maybe this produce is Israel. Maybe you're in Israel. People are going to get confused about where the border is. So the rabbi said, if you're in a borderland in Syria, in Egypt, these places, they single out and say there's a rabbinic responsibility to take truma there, just because otherwise it could be confusing. So the Ravid is saying, look, taking maaser, there you have to do it. So then anywhere else, it's got to be just the same. There must be a rabbinic requirement everywhere, not just, it can't be any worse than just outside the land of Israel where there's a responsibility. So the Ravid says everywhere there is a responsibility on a rabbinic level, even in the US in 2020. The Ravid says if you get produce, okay, if you're in Egypt, then the produce that you have that grows in Egypt, you have to tithe. But if you're in America and you get produce that comes from Israel, you should also have to tithe that rabbinically. That's what the Ravad says. He says, so he tweaks Rambam. He says, maybe Maimonides only meant that biblically, but rabbinically, there's still going to be a responsibility. That's what the Ravid says. He thinks there's still a rabbinic responsibility to do that. Any questions so far? Give another space here. At this point, though, and there are those who read Maimonides who disagree with what the Ravad says. And they say the Ravad says there's a rabbinic responsibility, but Rambam never says that. Maimonides says it is completely exempt. And so people look at Maimonides and look at Rambam over here in source number 6 and say, there is no obligation. There is no responsibility to take. If I get peppers from Trader Joe's that grew in Israel, that were then shipped to America, and I bought them in America, I would have no responsibility to tithe them, according to Maimonides. Even if I could know for certain that they were never tithed, I still don't have to tithe them here. What's outside the land of Israel, Maimonides is explicit. Ravad will say, biblically you don't have to, but rabbinically you do. So that's just a machloket. That's a disagreement between Maimonides, between the Rambam and the Ravad, about that. But it gets a little more complicated because what Maimonides' real position is not clear. Over here, you couldn't get any less clear than that. You can't get any more clear than that. It says it's exempt. The problem is that he has another comment elsewhere. There's a Mishnah in source number 8. Someone want to read for us source number 8? And we'll do 8 and 9 together. It'll be 8, 9, and 10 together, actually, because they're sort of a package deal.
Okay. The following things
Thanks,
must
Marlene.
be tithed. The following things must be tithed as demai.
So I'll pause you for a second. Demai, this concept of
Demai.
demai is something that if you know that it hasn't been tithed, it has the status of tevel, which means it hasn't been tithed. Let's say you have something that you don't know. The Talmud talks about, let's say you buy produce from someone who, is generally careful to tithe their produce, but you don't know, sometimes they're not so careful, okay. They might not, I don't know, my paternal grandmother used to say that that her father was a butcher, that even the rabbis ate from the meat from him. Okay, he was a really good butcher, a really kosher butcher. So let's say you don't have that butcher. So why do you 90% of the time you don't know. So demai is the status of we don't know, probably, maybe not, we're not really sure. So certain foods will say you always have to tithe anyway, and some foods you won't. So that's talking about things that will always have to be, if they're demai, if you're not really sure if they were tithed, you still have to tithe them. And that's here. Okay, so sorry, Marlene, keep going.
Pressed figs, dates, carobs, rice, and cumin. As to rice from outside the land of Israel, whoever uses it is exempt from tithing it.
Okay,
Yeah.
you can keep
Do you want me to
going.
go on? You just
Yeah.
scroll.
Oh, sorry. Here.
Yeah.
Okay.
These are the things that have the status of demai in all places, whether in Israel or outside Israel.
Okay, so Maimonides seems to say, it doesn't seem to say, he says that things can have the status of demai everywhere, whether they're in Israel, whether they're outside of Israel. You can have the status of saying, like, I'm not sure whether this was tithed or not. So Tosfot Yom Tov, source number 10, Marlene, you can keep going.
Rambam writes whether in Israel or outside Israel. If so, the fruits of Israel that leave Israel are obligated in Truma and Maser. In chapter 1 of Hilchot Terumah, he rules out that they are exempt even on a rabbinic level, based on the verse that says there.
Right, so Tosfot Yom Tov says we have a problem. The problem is that Rambam, in his commentary to the Mishnah, states very clearly that something has the status of demai and should be tithed, whether you're in Israel, whether outside of Israel. But when Maimonides, when he writes in the Mishnah Torah, and he records halacha, he says that it's absolutely exempt, even on a rabbinic level, on the basis of a scriptural learning, because it says there you take truma and maser, but not outside of the land of Israel. So Tosfot Yom Tov has a problem, because he says we have a contradiction in Maimonides. So it happens to be, this is not the first contradiction in Maimonides. There are many contradictions in the words of Maimonides, and they cause a lot of people to get very stressed out. What's interesting is that it's notable, Rambam wrote his commentary to the Mishnah when he was in his mid-20s, he writes. In his introduction, he writes how I think he was like 23 years old when he wrote his commentary to the Mishnah. So if you're over the age of 23 and you haven't written a full commentary to the Mishnah, Maimonides had. He was done. By the time, by my age, I haven't learned all of Mishnah. He had already read all of it and written a commentary on it. He's younger than me. Okay. So he wrote that when he was younger. The Mishnah Torah was considered his major work of halachic practice. So people will say, look, when he's a 20-year-old, he's a kid, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He has ideas, they're crazy ideas, he doesn't know. But then he wrote it for sure in the halachic codes. There are people who will say, you got to, ignore what Maimonides said when he was younger, follow what he says when he was older. Other people will say, look, but the more stringent one is when he was younger, so we should be more strict and we should follow the more stringent opinion and say even outside of Israel, we should still have to tithe things. So it's a huge debate. And what's interesting is that the major code I got really stressed out about. Stressed out is too strong of a word, but I got really bothered because many of the codes of Jewish law follow like what Maimonides says in the first source, which is that Israeli produce is exempt once it leaves the land of Israel. But in practice, people are strict about this. And I had a very difficult time understanding what was going on until I got to source number 11, this Rabbi Yosef Eliyahu Hinkin, the previous generation of major rabbis in Israel, in America. And he has a long extended thing where he basically addresses the fact that there's a big machloket, there's a contradiction in Maimonides' words, and no one knows what to do. And there are big rabbis who say this, there are big rabbis who say that, and you don't know what to do. And so he writes, Hatshuva Baza, the answer for this, lehalacha, in practice, kasher hadavar leachriya bein hashittot. He says it's very hard in practice to decide between these two positions. You have rabbis with really long beards who are saying Israeli produce outside of Israel is exempt, and you have rabbis with really long beards who say Israeli produce outside of the land of Israel is obligated. And he says, I can't weigh in as to what the truth with a capital T is. The haminhag, but the practice, what he knows, what he says, look, the reality of what people do though, shui kar gadol behalacha, which is a major concept in Jewish law, which is itself something that's worth talking about. But he says, look, I can't tell you what the right answer is. I can tell you what people do. And what people do is that haperot hamuva'in me'eretz Yisrael, fruits that come from Israel, tzrichin hechshem rabbanim mufhakim, they require certification from rabbis in Israel, shetarmu v'nit asru kedin, that they were tithed and they were tithed and the truma was taken appropriately. And so he recommends that he thinks that, you should really be careful about it. And if you get produce in America, which you don't know whether it was tithed or not. So that could be demai, as we saw, you don't know. And Rabbi Henkin says the general practice that people are careful with it. I don't know how in his time in the late 1900s, early 1900s. I'm not sure. I don't know whether practices have changed between then and now, but I will tell you that this was from 2 years ago. COR Detroit, the VOD in Detroit, put out a bulletin. Bell peppers from Israel, yellow, red, and orange, are now being sold at many stores, Meijer, Kroger, Trader Joe's, Holiday Market, and require taking of Trumot and Masrot. Sunset, Gilad, Arava, Field and Farm, Moore, Nature Fresh, Perro Valley, right? All these plants. So they put out a bulletin. So like, FYI, you should know, we should be careful about this and you should make sure to tithe it. And then they give you a little thing. So details of the tithing procedure can be found in the CRC. It says, but it says you should always be careful and check the country of origin because you never know. You should always be careful, and that's what they say. I think in general people try to be. It's not so common. There are peppers every now and then. I know from Trader Joe's. This I think was a big deal. This made the news all over the place in 2018. But I don't know how often it is that we find Israeli produce. But in theory, if you find Israeli produce, at least what Rabbi Henkin said 100 years ago, was that we just try to be careful about it and make sure to tithe things. No, there's ample positions that say not to. Maimonides himself is very clear; they're totally exempt. But there's enough positions, rabbis with long beards, who say that it's not exempt. That's probably appropriate too. I put on the bottom of the page something from 2004 I found online. The OU put out their whole procedure of how it's done. They make a point here of saying that many people just assume, the chief rabbi separates out all the Truman Maser that's exported. And apparently, at least in 2004, that wasn't the case. I don't know if things have changed since. But it's funny. I was actually listening to a talk of a mashgiach, the guy who sort of certifies a kosher restaurant in Israel. And he says, people think that the big thing in your kosher restaurant in Israel is, the kosher food and what's brought in and out. He says, you think you go to a restaurant that doesn't have hashgacha, that doesn't have certification. You think, I'm not going to get in the meat. I'm just going to get a salad. And the mashgiach was saying, a salad with all this produce, you have no idea if it's tithed or not. The 95% of what mashgiachs do in Israel is they make sure to tithe all the produce that comes in that's used in these restaurants. So it's just sort of funny so you might think, what could go wrong with the salad? So in Israel, really things could go much worse. People are concerned about various different things that may be rabbinic, and tithing could be biblical, and but salad could be the most dangerous if it hasn't been tithed appropriately in Israel, for sure.
What does it mean to tithe today?
Take a tenth. So you read over here.
And it's lasod ma.
Lasod ma. Oh, look at this. You can read it. The separated produce is designated in a coin. So the part that's maser sheni, you put on a coin and you put on a small. It has to be a pruta. I think we say a pruta is 5 cents. Put it on a nickel. Throw away the nickel. You can read the whole thing. That's what the concern for maser. At the time of this writing, 1 nickel is sufficient. There we go. No blessing is recited. Shuman maser may not be separated. Where is it? Over here. I thought they have a whole thing of how you do it. You have 100 oranges. You place it all in front of you. You take one whole orange, and a small part of the second orange is separated. You put it all in that, and then you toss the coin. The amount of northernmost part should be Truma Gedola, Maser Rishon, Maser Sheni. There you go. Then there's a whole thing about Charles, what you'd asked about Netta Revai, about when you can't use it for 3 years, the fourth. So he has a little thing there, what they say about that. But so there you go. That's your crash course. Certainly any Siddur, any Orthodox Siddur that you find that's printed in Israel will have this procedure, because in Israel there's no question, right? In Israel it's still going to be in force. A Siddurim that are printed in America, I think ArtScroll doesn't have it because they assume nothing. But the Koran Siddur already assumes probably that you may be getting Israeli produce, and I think in the Koran Siddur they'll have a little procedure. But every Orthodox Siddur in Israel has the whole process of how you do this. And even some Siddurim that are printed in America. I have a couple that, and we have like contemporary English books that are printed in the US that are now for like Anglo-Israelis. They have the procedure there as well. There are a lot of places you can find OU, CRC, but certainly many Israeli Siddurim have the process and some of the details as well on that. But so that's a really brief crash course in Truma and Maser. And again, why Tu B'Shvat is significant. Next week, we'll talk about some of the more mystical significance. But if you go back to temple times and someone's going to say, why are you, what's the significance of Tu B'Shvat? They tell you because it's tax day, right? It tells me when the fiscal year ends and when the new year begins, and that's why it's relevant. I had a rabbi in Yeshiva University, Rabbi Herschel Schechter in Yeshiva University. He didn't like all the partying that goes around Tu B'Shvat. If you get fruit platters, all this, he's like, I don't understand. It's relevant for tax purposes. He says, I don't know. People send their taxes. They sit around and celebrate with a fruit platter when they send their taxes to the IRS. Like he never really understood what the hype was it. But next week we'll talk about in the more mystical circles. Tu B'Shvat is a very holy day. But from a purely strict practical perspective, it's helpful for determining Maser, and hopefully you have a little more of an understanding of what this process of Truma and Maser is. And maybe if you end up getting bell peppers from Trader Joe's that say product of Israel, you have the opportunity to perform this mitzvah. I was going to say about Shemitahs. I remember when I was in yeshiva in Israel during the Shemitah year 2 years ago. So it's a Shemitah year. Everything is the whole land from a strictly halachic speaking is ownerless, and so any of the produce that you have, farmers they can't sell their property, they can't sell their product. So what do people do? Is a lot of times this was a major thing. This is called heter mechira, is that they would sell their land to someone who's not Jewish, and then the non-Jew would be able to work the land, and then they'd be able to sell the produce. There'd be a whole workaround to allow them to continue to retain the land, work the land, make money, and benefit from the land. And I believe Rabbi Shlomo Zal ben Auerbach, a major Orthodox halachic authority, he felt there was no strict problem with heter mechira, with selling the land of Israel. He said there's no, strictly speaking, there are many people, the Chazon Ish famously said that it's absolutely nothing. It's totally irrelevant. You can't sell the land. If you tried to sell the land, it didn't work. But Rabbi Shlomo Zal ben Auerbach says it works. It's totally a legitimate thing. He says, but why would you want to do that? He said, we've been outside the land of Israel for thousands of years, never been able to practice this halacha of Shemitah. And now all of a sudden we come back, and the first thing we want to do is find a loophole around it. And so, you could probably maybe say the same thing about Truma and Maser. Jews have never had the opportunity really to be able to be Truma and Maser for thousands of years. And now, okay, we can get to Israel, but even if we're choosing not to go to the land of Israel, not to perform these mitzvot, but at least we can, get shipments of these things and that didn't exist not so long ago. And so you could say that, even if you could make an argument, oh, you don't really have to do it. When are you going to have an opportunity to be mafresh, Truma and Maser? Unless you're in Israel, it's a great opportunity. So hopefully next time you get the bell peppers, then hopefully you'll buy Israeli products, just as it's good to buy Israeli products, and then you'll buy them and you'll have an opportunity to cut off a piece, toss one of the 100 peppers that you buy to be mafresh truma. I'll say that for the truma and the Cohen and the Levi who receive it, Mark Saper is a Cohen. I'm sure he's a very holy, very good, very pure Cohen. But the practice is that in 2020 we don't know. I'm not sure who Mark's great grandfather was. So we say any of the Kohanim, we say we don't give them the truma nowadays. And even if we could determine without question, as I'm sure Mark is a absolute descendant of Aharon, of the high priest, still we say outside of the land of Israel, who knows? We just assume everyone is impure in some way. And tamei met is we assume that someone you've at some point in your life have walked near a cemetery, over a cemetery, under a tree that's over a cemetery. Even a Kohen who's very careful about it, we assume they probably have become impure. And so they're not allowed to eat the truma in a state of impurity. So even if you have a Kohen who's absolutely 100% a Kohen, we still are concerned maybe they have contracted some impurity and so they can't consume the truma. So you can't give it to Mark Saper, despite how much you might want to. And that's that. So that's your crash course in truma. Any questions on that before we close? Okay, well, thank you for coming and for learning, and everyone should have a happy Tu B'Shvat, and keep it in mind when you're.
Sit down until he finishes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Come next week, and we'll do some of the more mystical significance of Tu B'Shvat as well.
Okay.
Thank you, Jared. Thank you.
Everyone, thank you so much for coming. Lila Tov.
Bye.
Thank you.
Sorry about it.
Thanks.